am most definitely not an expert, but I have arguably successfully negotiated 2 contracts for pediatric academic research positions. I'll fill you in on some of the details as we go so you could decide just how successful I was. But at the very least, hopefully I can share some tips and missteps and things I've learned along the way. So objectives for this morning, I'd like to start off by describing basic negotiation strategies to develop a framework to help you negotiate your best possible offer. And then last, but certainly not least, to make sure that we have a chance to answer your questions. So I wanted to start this off. I think we are going to launch a live poll here in just a second. I really just wanted to take the pulse here. So how do you feel about negotiating? We have the 3 emojis there.
I can see the answers coming in. All right, I think the answers should pop up hopefully when I click end poll. Let's see, share results.
Perfect, Paige. That was awesome. Thank you. And I'm actually impressed with this group. I will tell you that when I've done this before, when I've asked this question, that usually there's a lot of the vomiting emoji. So this group seems a bit more comfortable than perhaps what I've had in the past. So great to hear. But the reason I bring this up when we think about negotiating, I think a lot of people have a guttural response, usually not a good one. It's anxiety provoking, but you have to take a step back and really have to remember why we do this. We have all gone through a lot of training. We are all experts. We all bring a lot in the domains of research and clinical care. And we deserve to be recognized for that. We deserve to be compensated. We deserve benefits and things that are going to help us to succeed. And then last but not least, we are diabetes-oriented folks. We are not dermatologists, so we have bills to pay. We have quality of life to balance. So recognizing your importance and your value is important, and that's why we're doing all this. So I'll share a little bit about myself and some of the negotiations that I've been through, just to give you a little bit of light on the perspective I'm coming at this from. So I trained up in Boston. I was there from 2016 to 2019 and was quite certain that I was going to be a clinician, but changed my mind as I started doing research. My first negotiation was actually convincing my chief, a very basic science-oriented person, to pay for a master's in health science professions education that set me up well for my career and my research. And as I was in Boston, realized a little bit late to the game that I liked research. I did not have funding coming out, so I was in a tricky spot when I went to get my first job, and actually wasn't even sure if I would be able to continue in research. So looked at quite a few different options and ultimately had a nice startup package that took me to Children's National in Washington, D.C. I was there for a few years, had some amazing mentors, but ultimately realized it was probably not the perfect position for me. And so about 2 years into that, I started looking for another position. Ultimately, I got a K-23 award that sort of opened up doors, and I'll share tips and tricks from that. So to frame this for you, I'm going to borrow heavily from this book. It's called Getting to Yes. This came out of the Harvard Negotiation Project, and it's this idea of principled negotiation, which centers around 4 different ideas as to how to negotiate. So step 1, you have to separate the people from the problem. Second concept is that you have to focus on interests, not positions. Third is that we need to invent options for mutual gain. And then last is this idea of insisting on objective criteria. So we are going to delve a bit more into this. So I am a pediatrician, and as a pediatrician, I am entitled to talk about Disney when I give talks. So when we talk about separating people from the problem, I am going to borrow from the movie Turning Red, which not only highlights this concept perfectly, but also very nicely featured diabetes technology in it. So many reasons to enjoy this movie. But for those who haven't seen it, the movie is about a Chinese-Canadian student named May, who has this terrible hereditary curse where anytime she experiences a strong emotion, she turns into a giant red panda, which is less than optimal for a 13-year-old girl. And the reason I bring this up, I think looking back at the poll that we did just a few minutes ago, negotiations are stressful. They are anxiety producing. They have big implications for your career and for your future. And so it's understandable that emotions will be involved. But when we think about it, we do need to sort of try our best to put them aside and to come at this objectively. Also, it's just so important to recognize that the way people look at things will be very different. The way that I'm thinking about a negotiation is very different from the way that my chief is thinking about a negotiation. We are looking at it differently. We have different goals, and really highlights the importance of communicating clearly in an even-keeled way, so that you can really identify the issue it is that you're trying to solve. Second principle is this idea of focusing on interests and not positions. And the way I like to think about this is really the importance of doing your homework. You need to know the facts. You need to know the things that you are looking at, and sort of understanding that with those facts, you're trying to get to a mutual goal, and that it's not saying I'm in this camp and you're in that camp. It's really trying to solve a problem. So I wanted to share a little bit of information and just ways to help put this in context. This is our diabetes team here at CHOP. So we have 7 physicians that see people with diabetes, and that's across 8 different clinical locations. So when I was looking at this, when I saw that we have upwards of 30 physicians, only a few that do diabetes, just how many satellite offices there were, said to me that there was an opportunity. Whether you're looking at this as a clinician or as a researcher, you can see that there's certainly room here. And understanding the team, understanding how you fit into that team is important. As much as we have a large team here at CHOP, there wasn't anybody doing type 1 diabetes technology research. So when I looked at this, I said, this is a good opportunity for me. The other way to think about this, and really to help you sort of put things in perspective, is to understand that people focused on diabetes, we are a hot commodity right now. We're seeing rising trends in diabetes. And yet, when you look across the years with endocrinology being captured in this reddish orange color here, you'll see the number of applicants for endocrinology training positions versus the number of positions available. And you'll see that there is a declining number of applicants over time. And then this is actually data from the match. So the match data, this is the most recent, came out last year. In pediatric endocrinology, only 65% of applicants matched into a position, and the final fill rate after the scramble was 86%. So there are plenty of training programs that don't have trainees in them. And when we think about statements from the Pediatric Endocrine Society, we're seeing a declining workforce. We're seeing more people retiring. We've seen career shifts with the pandemic. There is a need, and there are not enough people to fill that need. I focused on pediatrics here just because I am a pediatrician, but I promise you the adult data looks quite similar. The other piece, and a huge thank you to Paige for her help with this, thinking about our colleagues in psychology. Apologies that I don't have data exactly for everyone, but did want you to know that you can look up salaries for all these different positions and really to understand how important this is. So this data is from the Society of Pediatric Psychology. It was collected in 2017, and this was a self-report of compensation for members. There, as you'll see here, as you look across the non-academic clinical positions and sort of the years of experience that people have, there's a range of salaries. So understanding that and recognizing what is an average salary, is the offer I'm being made, is it reasonable? Is it above average? Is it below average? But also understanding that this doesn't consider everything. If you are looking at a position in California where the cost of living is high, you would expect the compensation to be higher. At the same time, if you're looking in a more rural area that's underserved, compensation may also be a bit higher there. So really just doing some benchmarking, knowing what you're looking at heading into things. The other thing that I'll highlight is the importance of really talking to colleagues. This is a snapshot across the country, so understanding in the specific locations that you're looking is always a good idea.
Can I ask a question about that?
Please.
So when you say years of experience, does that not include like the years that you were in training, or like how do you know what to say?
It's a great question, and honestly, I've seen it defined different ways in different places, so always good to clarify. For this particular survey, they were looking at years of experience post-training.
Okay. And then would like a postdoc be considered training or not?
Ooh, that's a great question. Paige, do you have insights on that one?
I think it is considered training because most people, you need that before you can get licensed. I mean, there are some people probably who have enough hours before that, but I'm pretty sure, and I could even try to check the article while we're or double check that while we're continuing the talk.
Yeah,
Thank
because
you
it's
so
so
much.
confusing, like seeing like all these job ads that are like this many years of experience, and you're like, well, I've been doing research for this many years, but technically, like I was a student or I was a whatever. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely, and happy to reach out to some colleagues of mine that work in psychology, see if I can get you a better answer after this as well. So we'll shift over now. We're going to look at endocrinologist salaries. So on the top, you have internal medicine. On the bottom, you have pediatrics. Hopefully this data is not a shock to anyone. Those of us choosing pediatrics do it at a bit of a financial cost. But what you can see here, as much as there was a range in psychology salaries, there is even more of a range here. And some of that is driven by the type of position, whether it's an academic position or a private practice. And also thinking about the location again. So just the importance of having a sense here so that you know what it is that you're asking for. Circling back to our ideas of principled negotiation, the third concept here is this idea of inventing options for mutual gain. I've always joked that I would love a toilet made out of solid gold in my office. I considered negotiating for it, but ultimately realized it would not help anyone but me. So it's never anything that I have asked for. So when you think about what it is that you're negotiating for, you want to come up with something that's beneficial to both parties. So when we look at our team at CHOP, we realize that we could use a few more people to do diabetes. Even as a researcher, to say that I'm interested in seeing patients in clinic is an important way to do that. So making sure that what you're proposing is also good for the other party, so you can really generate a win-win. And one of the ideas that I really like is this concept of growing the pie. So I think when we negotiate, it's tempting to hold your cards close, to not reveal too much of what you are and are not interested in. But this sort of makes me think about it a little bit differently. And it's this idea that if you are willing to have an open conversation about things, to explain what it is that you're hoping to do, where you want to see your career go, the things that you need to do that, you may actually empower your chief, or the person it is that you're negotiating with, to think of some ideas that are really a little bit outside of the box, things that would not have initially been in play that would actually be great for everyone. So don't be afraid to do that. And then the last principle here is this idea of insisting on objective criteria. I like to think about this in the context of SMART goals. I think we all do this when we are in clinic, creating things that are specific, that are measurable, that are achievable, realistic, and timely. And so when you are asking for something, it's not just, I would like protected time, it's I would like this amount of protected time to do that particular task. So just making sure that you're clear on what it is you're asking for. The other thing that I will remind you here is that diabetes is a pretty small world. You'll see very quickly that you get to know many of the players, that you will see these people again and again. People that I was interviewing with that I ultimately declined offers from, I now sit on committees with them. They're reviewing papers. So just remember, when you're asking for goals, be reasonable. Don't take advantage of the situation too much, but finding that balance and making sure that you're asking for things that you need. This sort of leads me into the next idea. When I was first learning about negotiations, one of the terms that I heard was this idea of a BATNA. It seems to be one of those buzzwords. And what it stands for, it's this idea of the best alternative to the negotiated agreement. And this really recognizes that there are huge power imbalances when you're negotiating. Little me in my baby sumo diaper negotiating with the chief of endocrinology at CHOP. It was clear that I was the low man on the totem pole. And what the BATNA says is that, like we talked about at the beginning, when you're negotiating, you are taking these steps to make sure that you get yourself to a better position than if you had not negotiated. So as you're talking about things, you need to know the point at which you are going to walk away. What's the point at which the suggested proposal is actually leaving you in a worse position than if you had not negotiated? So understanding that bottom line, and then also having a backup plan for yourself. So you can negotiate a little bit harder when you have two positions that you are open to, versus if you are tied geographically to one area and you really want to be mindful of it, you may have a little bit less power. The other thing that has surprised me along the way, I remember just out of fellowship, I was at my first first interview, everything went great, gave the job talk. I was very excited, and I thought we were going to sit down and I was going to have my list of requests and we were going to talk it over and see what we could come to. And my mind was blown when I learned about this idea of the wish list. It's a term that I've heard multiple times, and essentially what this turns into is an email and a list of things once you have that offer, the things that you're asking for. When you create this wish list, this is your one chance. You don't get to send an email and then follow up a few hours later and add something on. So you really want to put everything on the line here. And I am going to borrow a quote from Stan Musial, who was one of the great baseball hitters. And what he said that applies very nicely in negotiations is that the first principle of contract negotiations is not to remind them of what you did in the past, but to tell them what you're going to do in the future. So when I was putting my wish list together as a clinical researcher, the most important thing to me was my team. So in my initial offer, I had support for a research assistant, but what I truly needed was a nurse practitioner on my team. And I had this exact nurse practitioner in mind. She worked with me in Washington and was actually eager to move to Philadelphia with me. So when I was asking for things, I said, I know this nurse practitioner is more expensive than a research assistant, than a diabetes educator, but if you want me to run these clinical trials, if you want to bring more diabetes technology to CHOP, if you want to see me succeed, I need this particular person to help me do that. And when you can frame your wish list like that to explain the things that you will bring, the things that you will do, it really sort of ties all these principles together nicely. Other things to think about sort of putting on this wish list, I think when we talk about negotiations, salary and signing bulletins is of course the thing that comes to mind. It's the low-hanging fruit on the totem pole. We showed the data, something worth knowing about, something worth thinking about. But I will tell you that not every institution will actually negotiate on salary. Sometimes it is based on years of experience and academic rank. And as frustrating as that may feel, it really opens the box for other things. It's nice not to be stressing if you are being compensated in the same way as your colleague in the next office over, and really lets you think about other things that you need to succeed. One thing that shocked me, office space, depending on where you are, if this is an institution that's in the city where space is a hot commodity, you may need to ask about office space. You may not want to be clear on the other side of campus when your team is going to be in a different place. So relatively minor point, but worth asking about. Also this idea of academic appointments and academic rank. So not so relevant when you're looking at your first position, but sometimes people will use this as a way to get promoted from assistant to associate maybe a little bit sooner than they could have within their institution. And while you are in communications with your chief and thinking about how to do it, they may be in a position to push to support you for that promotion. Leadership opportunities is another something. So Paige told you I have the title, I'm the director of technology for the Diabetes Center. That was a title that did not exist until I started negotiating. And what it was, I'm really interested in someday helping to run a diabetes program, and I sort of wanted a promise of that. So my chief said, I haven't worked with you yet. I am not quite sure if you're the right person for that. And so she didn't want to give me too much of a title, but she gave me a little something, which to me said that she's interested in me, that she supported me, and it made me feel like it gave me a chance to grow and to learn and to work towards my goals. In today's world, I think the ability to work remotely is something that's so important for many of us. Looking at backgrounds, I'm going to guess a few of us may be at home just like me today. Depends on the work you do, but don't be afraid to ask about it if it's something that's important for you. Another thing worth being aware of is this idea of a non-compete clause. So oftentimes when you sign a contract, if you are to leave that institution, you cannot work for a competing institution that's within a certain radius. And this may vary in importance. So if you have moved to a city just for a job, and if you were to leave that job and it doesn't matter, that non-compete is probably not a big deal for you. But as someone who finally made it home, I'm back where my family is. I am excited to be where I am. My hope is that I'm in my current position for a long time. But if something falls through and I can't work at any other institution in a 20-mile radius, that effectively means that I would have to leave Philadelphia. May or may not be negotiable, but worth asking about. I've certainly had a few friends who have successfully had that removed from contracts. And then other things to think about: administrative time. How many clinic sessions a week is expected? I've seen it vary from 6 to 9 or 10, depending on the institution that it is that you're looking at. And just thinking about a little bit of protected time to help you get your work done within the workday instead of later at night. Academic stipends. How much money do you get to go to a meeting? How much money do you get to support publication costs? Do they cover your licenses? Do they cover boards? All good things to ask about. The last few, probably less likely to be negotiable, but I put them up there just in case. Vacation time, retirement, disability, healthcare insurance, tuition benefits. Even if they're not negotiable, I wanted to include them because they are things that are worth asking about. If you have a really great health insurance package, or if you are heading towards having kids in college someday and the tuition's there, maybe something that almost is like a boost to your salary that you should at least know about. And then I wanted to split it up a little bit. Apologies that I'm being a little bit research focused, honestly, just because it's what I know, but I have spoken to several clinical friends to try to give you some insights. So I shared with you the importance for me as a researcher of people. I need my research assistant. I need clinical people to help me with some of the insulin delivery systems that we use so we can get them started. And a statistician. The statistician may not seem like a big deal, but I have seen real struggles at many institutions to have access. Sometimes it's outsourced and the quality of the outsourcing can be variable. Sometimes it's limited time. You may actually have to subcontract across institutions from a pediatric hospital into an adult hospital. So just being aware of what that setup is and knowing if you may need some extra funding to support that. Speaking of funding, oftentimes a contract will come with what's called a startup package. And this gives you a little bit of money to get yourself up and running, whether that's buying freezers or buying lab space for a basic scientist, whether it's personnel support for someone who's doing clinical work, something that you'll need to know about, and publication costs as well. I am completely shocked every time I pay to publish in a journal. I can never believe how much money that is. Sometimes that will be on you as the researcher. It'll come out of your package. I've had other chiefs who have said, I don't want you to worry about this. I want you to publish as much as you can, so I will take care of the costs. So definitely a question worth asking. On the clinical side, I will tell you at CHOP, I am about 2.5 hours away from some of our satellites. Fortunately, I don't go to those satellites, but someone does. And ideally that person lives a little bit closer. So not just asking how many sessions you're expected to do, but also where are those locations? And is that something that's negotiable? Is there a need that's closer to your house? Do you want to think about where you live based on where it is that you're going? Clinic templates can also vary quite widely as well. So I have friends who do full-time 6 clinical sessions a week. I have friends who do 8 clinical sessions a week. And it's a good bit of time that it takes. How long are your templates? Do you get 30 minutes to do a new patient? Do you get an hour to do a new patient? That has huge implications. Do you mix diabetes and endocrine into a single template? Are they on separate days? What does that look like? All questions to ask. And then don't forget about the importance of your support personnel in clinic. I don't want you taking your own blood pressures. I don't want you downloading your devices. Are there people there to help you with those things? And then also nursing support. Is there someone who's going to help you with phone calls, who's going to help you with all the school forms when it comes time for kids to go back? And then the other piece is this idea of protected time. Can you get some time that sort of keeps you out of clinic a little bit so that you can set up a program or run a program or develop a quality improvement project that you're interested in? And I think in conclusion, I'm going to wrap it up. I'm going to share a little bit more about my experiences and honestly some of the mistakes that I've made along the way so that hopefully you don't do it. I think the first thing and probably the most important thing is to realize that you're valuable. You need to realize that. You need to ask the questions for yourself, because if you don't, no one else will. So don't forget that piece. I think we get trained in sort of these match processes that we all go through, that we are lucky just to get a position and to have everything work, but don't forget that you are a highly trained, highly valuable individual. The other thing I've learned is that the perfect job does not exist. I had this idea in my head that I would get exactly everything I wanted at one place, and what I've discovered, everything has some pros and cons. You just have to figure out which mixture of those is going to work best for you and make sure that you're happy with it. The other thing, and I laughed when my mentor told me this, she said that my first job would not be my last. I was so stressed as I was looking for my first job out of fellowship, and so worried about picking the right one and making sure I was well positioned. And I remember laughing at her. I was like, Melissa, this is it. This is where I'm staying. I'm going to set up. I'm going to move ahead. And 2 years later, when I reached back out to her to look for help for the next job, we had a good laugh over that. And for me, I think just hearing that, it took a little bit of the pressure off. It helped me to realize that this is a starting point, that I can sort of adjust as needed to get where it is that I'm trying to go. The other thing I'll tell you is that both of the positions that I've taken were actually not posted. This was all through networking. They were posted once I talked to people and once I heard about them. But don't be afraid to work your mentors and your connections. A warm email from a mentor, if there is a particular institution that you are looking to get into, is always a good idea. Make use of the meetings. Make use of the poster sessions, of ways that you can find a way to talk with people, because I will tell you, when you're looking, just having a face to put with a name is a great help. The other thing, and I've said this a few times now, but I'll say it once more, if you don't ask, you'll never know. Don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. And the other thing I found, my first go around with negotiations, I really only had one offer for the position it was that I actually wanted to do. Could have had a clinical position that I probably would have been very happy with, but I was set on research, and I was trying to negotiate with my chief, and one of the clinical positions I had was in a more rural location. And I marched into my chief and I said, hey, I want this salary. And he completely laughed at me. It was fairly comical. He said, that's great, Brynn. If you want to move to a more rural location and be a clinician, you should go ahead and do it. So I learned that lesson kind of the hard way there. But second time around, when I was looking, had a couple of different places that I could have gone, and really for me to hear sort of different ideas from expanding the pie with different chiefs at different places, to get ideas of things that I hadn't thought about that would really help me, was useful when I was negotiating. And then last but not least, lean on your mentors. Whether it's trying to benchmark for salary, whether it's learning from their mistakes, whether it's helping you to connect with people, your mentors are there to help you in many different ways, and it's a great time to use them with contracts. So in conclusion, just to highlight really the practice of principled negotiations. So communicate clearly, take your emotions out of the mix, do your homework, and really focus on creating specific, mutually beneficial solutions for you and your institution. Remember that you're valuable. Dream big when you come up with that wish list. Think of the things that you need to succeed and a way to justify it. And then last but not least, don't forget your BATNA. Know the point at which your negotiation has not been fruitful, and know when you need to fall back on that backup plan. So I think that's all that I had for this morning, but more than eager to talk and to see how I can be helpful with everyone.
Thank you so much. This was great. We do have a few questions that people had submitted ahead of time, but I would love to just open the floor for people who are here and have questions. Although I do have one more technical question. Are you willing, Dr. Marks, to share your slides? I know we'll have it recorded, but someone had asked in the Q&A.
Sure, happy to.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And with that, I'll kind of open it up to other people before we look at the questions that were submitted.
I have another question. So first of all, this is really helpful. So thank you so much. You were talking about looking up salaries online. I know that that's available for a lot of public universities, but I guess I'm wondering a little bit more about like what to do in terms of like private research institutes, because that kind of information you probably can't find online. And I've been trying to talk to some of my mentors about that kind of stuff, and their advice has been sort of like, why don't you just email people there and ask them what their salary is? And I'm like, oh my God, is that even okay?
Oh, such a great question and a tricky one. I would agree. I think the only way you're going to get the information that you want is via an email, but also probably not the first email that you want to send to someone. Hi, I'm Brynn. How much money do you make? So
Yeah.
it may be that sort of as you're on the interview path, as you're getting to know people, hopefully they've set up sort of some more casual encounters. You can kind of find people who are your stage of the game where you might be able to ask in a more casual way. And then otherwise, those public universities, at least ideally, you ought to make a little bit more at a private institution. But I think just having a sense of a benchmark and what's reasonable, at least to put yourself in sort of the ballpark in terms of where things are.
Okay. So your advice is to try to befriend people so it's not awkward.
Yes. And
Okay.
certainly if you have other colleagues, other friends that have gone about it, I certainly felt very awkward when I was trying to do it, but as you work your networks and as you reach out to your connections, other people may know. The people that you're asking these questions of were in your shoes not too long ago. So my
Yeah.
experience has been that people are happy to help, but I know it is certainly not an easy conversation to start.
Okay, cool.
Or potentially asking people at similar institutions, right? So not necessarily the one that you're going to, but a similar type of institution that you might know. So for former trainees from the research program you're at, who have ended up in jobs that you're looking at, who I would recommend reaching out to anyways before you start interviewing at those places. But they may be able to give you what their equivalent offers were like.
Yeah. Okay.
And you could ask what's the typical range instead of what do you make? You could say what's the typical range for an assistant professor, associate professor.
Yeah.
So
that sounds
people are more likely to provide a range versus a precise number.
Yeah. That's very helpful. Thank you.
And I have to say, it's good to go in before somebody asks us in the chat about negotiation. It's good to have that information before, I think a couple of people said this, before you even apply, because I was on the back end of hiring somebody and I'd hired a male colleague, a male 3 months before I hired her. He asked for a salary. We gave it to him. She asked for a salary that was $10,000 less. And HR wanted to give her the $10,000 less salary. Luckily, I was like, well, they're the same level. Why are we paying her $10,000 less, right? So, but I think some of it was she just didn't know, right? So it's always good to have that information, and and remember, it's a negotiation, right? So you want to ask for more than you really want, right? Because they're gonna probably not meet you. If you're I mean, there are different tactics, but that's the one I always sort of take is understanding that if they're going to negotiate, they'll meet you somewhere in the middle, right? So understanding that too is I think helpful. Don't undersell yourself is I guess what I'm saying.
And Josh, your example made me think of something. When I did women's leadership training, we were advised as women to ask your male colleagues what they're asking for in startup and in salary, because typically women don't ask for as much nor get as much. So it was just highly encouraged to ask male colleagues what they're asking for.
We do have a question in the chat, but I wanted to go back. I know Melanie, you had asked earlier about that article and if it was if postdocs were included, and it was people who were licensed clinical psychologists, so very unlikely to be postdocs. And it was the years since you obtained your doctoral degree, and then but you had to be a practicing pediatric psychologist, so fully licensed. When I was looking at those salaries, I was like, those don't look like postdoc salaries.
Yeah.
But yeah. And then in the chat, we have a question from Rebecca. Do you start these conversations during the interview stage? We kind of just talked about this, but do you start these conversations during the interview stage or only once an offer has been made?
Great question. And I'll agree with, I think, what everyone else has said. I think doing your research before you go in, reaching out to colleagues, reaching out to friends, whether or not it's at the same institution, just so that you have a sense of what to do. But typically my experience has been the negotiations don't actually start until the offer. You don't want to look too presumptuous, sort of trying to negotiate before the cat's in the bag, so to speak. But I think the more you go in prepared to that interview, the more that you can try to understand where things are at. That will then prepare you to negotiate and to ask those questions a little bit later on.
I think I'm not sure how to exactly word this question, but I think I have a concern about coming across to, and I don't know if greedy is the right word, but with negotiations, like, can you explain what you think a feel is for bringing up topics that have to do with money and topics that have to do with professional advancement? And if, you know, people tend to focus on, like, I don't know what the balance there should be.
It's, yeah, never an easy topic to bring up, but I think two things that I'll highlight. I think one, if you do your benchmarking, if you kind of know what the expectation is, that way you're not asking for the $500,000 salary that would come across greedy. So if you have a sense, if you know what the median is in that particular area, and then you ask for a little bit more, I think to Jess's point, you kind of end up somewhere in the middle and hopefully make a little bit of progress. Honestly, the negotiations there for me have been a little bit separate. It's like salary on one piece, and then things that you need to succeed and to set yourself up for success and advance the division are kind of looked at a little bit separately. So don't be afraid to negotiate and to ask about both.
I mean, I don't know if you were trying to ask Becky about like negotiations for things that are not salary or for research, but for career development. Was that kind of what you were?
Yeah,
what-
I guess more just like professional development. And I know a lot of that comes down to money at the end. Like, are you willing to, you know, help me have this person to help me or pay for this training or this, you know, membership or whatever. But I guess I was just wondering, like, when a committee is first presented with, you know, an applicant's negotiation or wish list, do they kind of sit down and think, okay, is this all about how much money we're giving them, or where are the resources actually going?
Sugar, do you want to take it, or I'm happy to?
I mean, I don't have a ton of experience, so others can speak on this, but I do find that in general, having the details similar to what Brynn said about publications, or like if you can justify what you're asking for, then I think it comes off as very thoughtful in that negotiation for what you're looking for, especially if it might be something that's out of the box of something that someone hasn't asked for previously in your role. But if it makes a lot of sense for your own success, then I think it is nice to have that as a detailed line item on your wish list to say like why you're also asking for it. How would you approach it, Brynn? I mean,
Yeah, I did the same. I honestly, when I put my wish list together for many of the things, it wasn't monetary. So I did not do the research to see what the nurse practitioner salary was, but I said I need 0.5 FTE for a nurse practitioner, and then really justified it in the same paragraph. It was like, these are the things that you want me to do, and this is what I need to get that done for you. So what happened with me was that CHOP actually did the research. They said, you know, this is what we pay our nurse practitioners, so here is the monetary equivalent for that ask. But then to the other points about publication costs, about meeting costs, I think with that one, it is helpful to actually give a range, you know, justify it and explain what the ask is for, but then in parentheses, you know, the estimated cost is about this. Anyone else have experience with that? I don't know that I have all the right answers, so happy to hear from anyone else.
I thought these all great answers and questions that we're having here. I actually had a question too related to, I know you said you should know like when what your limit is, when you're like, you know what, this isn't worth it, like I'm just gonna back off. But how do you know if you've like pushed hard enough, or if you've hit their limit of what they're willing to negotiate? Is it usually pretty clear, like this is it, this is your final offer, take it or leave it? Or yeah, I guess like kind of figuring out that balance.
Yeah, good question.
I don't know how many times you can go back and forth, because you also want to be respectful of their time, and
Right. It's a great question. I think when you come up with that wish list, when you're writing it, I think you have to decide what your personal priorities are. So that's your one big chance to ask. You're not going to send that and say, oh, by the way, I would also like $50,000 to do this. So make sure it's in that initial one. But then as you sort of value it, it's where are the places that you want to push. You're not going to be able to push hard on everything, and some of the answers may be pretty clear. But really figuring out if there's something that's truly important to you, if that is your make or break in terms of whether you want to take that position. When I was actually negotiating for the nurse practitioner, it took me about 8 weeks. No one had ever asked for that before. We started off via email, and I think there was a lot of Brynn, you're crazy. What do you think you need this for? But ultimately, I was able to have a conversation. And once I had that conversation, it worked out beautifully. So there was really an understanding.
So I can add, I just recently changed institutions and underwent negotiation with more than one institution. And so I did exactly what Brynn said. I made a wish list. I did it as an Excel file. I actually tried to have it be fairly accurate because I did want it to be justified. So if I had my final number, and I included, like, I looked up fringe rates for the institutions I was interviewing with. So I understood, like, you can't just ask for, I wanted to understand what my total ask was for salary, and for, you have to ask for fringe too if you're asking for personnel. And then I did kind of look at it like an NIH budget justification. Like, I came to my number, is this well justified? Because if I could justify it, then I felt fully confident asking for this number. And I had and in the end, the one institution said, okay, like, I actually offered, like, I have a spreadsheet. If it's helpful, I'll share it, but I made them ask for it. And once I provided the spreadsheet, I got my full startup that I wanted, because they could see everything was well justified. I wasn't overestimating anything. Everything was, I had done my due diligence and looked at.
That's interesting, Sarah. So your ask was a final number. It wasn't a list of why.
I did have a list of things
Okay.
that I had generated in an Excel file, and I did have some professional things to Rebecca's question in there too. But then I had my final number, and then it was higher, but I felt confident because it was well justified. And then the leadership came back and said, because I had offered, like, I've started the spreadsheet, if helpful, I'm willing to share it. And they said, yes, could you please share the spreadsheet? And I did. So then it was itemized, right, by everything, personnel, fringe, equipment. And I did the fringe according to that institution. And then I got my full startup. There wasn't another level of negotiation.
I like that one. You just gave me a tip. I may need an Excel file next time.
So Sarah, I did something similar when I negotiated here, and what my colleagues and I did is that we kept those files and then we shared them amongst each other to have an idea. So if you can find, I think this is going to what Melanie was saying, like, if you know other people at your stage who are applying and you guys can share from each other, or you know people who have just recently done that, that can be very, very helpful. Just to get a better sense if you're not sure if there are things that others are asking for that you may not have thought of. I love that, Sarah. That's great. Going down to the fringe on that institution. That's great.
I liked how you also said, like, this is what made me feel really confident in asking for this, because that was actually another question that someone had submitted, was how do you negotiate with confidence and authenticity? And I think it sounds like, and please expand more if you would like, but being really, really prepared and having all of that figured out ahead of time helped you feel really, really confident.
Yeah, and I felt like going down to the fringe at that specific institution, let the leadership know I was trying to be thoughtful. I'm not just asking to ask. Like, I did my due diligence, and I didn't feel, I mean, yeah, I guess I can't remember. I don't think I felt nervous because I had done my due diligence.
Mm-hmm. Thoughtful
So-
and shows that you're very serious. If you're like looking up their fringe rates and everything, they're like, she is serious applicant. It's great.
I wanted to ask, so I have also had to put together a list like that for a job, but it was more like the research side is, I would be running a very small lab. And so I included on that list, like, essentially everything that I thought I would need, right? So I, like, mapped out, like, a new centrifuge, a new freezer, this, that, and whatever. And then because of this institution, like, they shared a lot of that equipment. There's no reason why I would necessarily need my own. So I guess my approach there was, I'd rather put it on the list and give them an opportunity to cross it off like we already have that. Is that, I don't know. But then I felt like I worried that by it being so inclusive and putting everything on the list, that then all of a sudden my number became like something that might kind of be absurd to them.
I think
Sarah,
again, if it's well justified, you should have it on your list. And let's say you really truly like, I need my own centrifuge. I cannot share that. And so I had no trouble putting things that, I mean, your new institution wants you to be successful. So what are the items that are going to make you successful where you're at that are essential? Go ahead. Sorry, Brynn.
no, I was actually going to ask you to take that one. I have no knowledge of centrifuges, so I'm glad you do.
Well, the same could be said for personnel though, like, or things that you think could be a shared resource. Like if you are starting your research program and you will need, 50% of the nurse practitioner versus, full nurse practitioner, you could have a list that's like things that you primarily need, and then things that potentially could be cost shared or shared amongst others. But that lets them know that you don't know what that's going to look like, right? So if that resource isn't available, this is the budget that you would need. If it is available, this is, the alternative.
I had another question. I was wondering, I know this probably could be a very long kind of taxing process at times, but if you had any tips on how you stay kind of resilient through it all and don't just say, oh, okay, I'm fine. I'm just going to take what you're willing to give me. And yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's slow for sure, especially if you're looking at multiple institutions and waiting on an offer from one place before you move ahead. I think the thing that really kept me going, because it was long, was thinking about what I needed to succeed. It was a big move. I did not want to make a move again. I really wanted to be sure that I was walking into a place that was going to make me successful and that I had the things that I needed to be successful. So that was what I kept looking at as I was waiting. But honestly, Paige, I think the waiting game is the most painful. It's not a lot of active effort. It's hurry up and wait. And then you get the emails and then you have to respond and play the strategies and compare the offers that you have then.
That totally makes sense.
I just thought of another question. So, lots of places have core facilities for large equipment. And all of those facilities, it'll charge a certain rate for if you use their equipment. So maybe you could make the argument that, if I'm going to run this many samples a year on the cores equipment, it would cost this much money versus if I bought this equipment myself, it would be cheaper or equivalent cost or something. And I guess I'm just wondering if putting something like that in a negotiation would be how that kind of a thing would be looked at, because I know also there's a lot of things that go into equipment purchases in terms of not just buying the equipment, but also like maintaining the equipment, paying for service contracts, stuff like that. So my question is almost like how much detail is too much detail, and like would putting this kind of like a plan together to say, hey, no, I want to buy my own this huge piece of equipment, is that going to come off as like offensive, or would that be okay?
Sarah, can I ask for your help on this one again?
Sure. I think it depends on the cost of the huge equipment, right? Like a centrifuge is a small ask, but like if something's like $500,000, maybe that's a harder piece of equipment to justify, unless, I would say it probably depends on your funding level as well. So if you had, more than one R01, that was really contingent on you being able to run these samples. And that the core facility is always backlogged, that would hinder your success. So I think it's balancing the cost, or would you be willing to make this a shared resource, right? So it's not just your
Yeah.
lab, right? Then I think that comes across more, again, depending on the cost, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's helpful.
No, it is. I think you're almost like suggesting that it would be a more appropriate ask for someone who already is funded to do a certain amount of work. So you need to be able to do that work. So probably not for like an assistant professor level, but more like associate. Yeah. Okay.
Or just you have to justify it again,
Yeah.
right? It comes
Yeah.
down to justification.
Yeah. Yeah.
But like Melanie, I think of flow cytometry as an example of this, where
That's
there's,
exactly what I'm thinking.
yeah. So like if
Exactly
you,
what I asked.
yeah, so if you're going to an institution and they don't have the type of machine that you need, then you need to ask for that machine, right? If there's something specific and the
Mhm.
core doesn't have it. If the core has it, it's going to be expensive to use. So I would budget the approximate number hours of use and what you think you're going to spend, because that has to come from somewhere, right? But you know, if they don't have the piece of equipment that you need, you need to kind of, do need to ask for it. Otherwise you will not be successful when you get started there, especially if it's key for your research.
Yeah.
Any other questions in our final few minutes here? But if we don't have any other questions, we could wrap up a little early. I did have one thought that I realized I wrote down and forgot to say. I'm not sure if it's how relevant it is to everybody on this group, but within psychology, because I'm guessing a lot of people, if you're in School of Medicine, there's like one department that you're, well, maybe not assigned to or affiliated with, but I know within psychology, I've heard like differing opinions, like at different institutions, being appointed within psychiatry versus psychology versus pediatrics can actually affect your salary. And so it might be another thing to think about too. But I had never heard that before, so I thought that was really interesting in a postdoc talk that they gave in Colorado to all of us. So yeah. But if there are no, oh yeah.
I was going to say salaries and access to students. So those can vary depending on which, if you're like affiliated with the clinical department, and you'll have to figure out how to navigate that. So yeah, you do need to think about that depending on what kind of school you're applying to, what department you would have and what access already exists in the department.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, with that, if there aren't any other questions, we can wrap up. But this was an incredible discussion. I really appreciate your time today, Brynn, and that awesome presentation. And we will hope to get it converted to a YouTube format and up on our website soon. And I'll send the slides around to the people who attended today.
Thanks
Or
so
who
much.
registered ahead of time. So if you did not put your name on the Google sheet, then make sure to do that.
Paige, thank you so much for organizing and everyone for joining this morning. Great to speak with all of you, and good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brynn.